Our next speaker is Jeff Gicklhorn. Jeff is a master's student at the University of Nevada, Reno. He's working with Dr. Beth Newingham on the effects of grazing on post-fire responses.
Thank you, everybody. I'm also really excited to be speaking. And I appreciate the question to John's talk about what we're doing to answer sort of real-time questions that managers have. My own research, which I'm not going to be presenting on today, is looking at post-fire grazing management and the effects on seedlings, establishment, growth and survival. What I am going to be presenting on is one of the Great Basin Landscape Conservation Cooperative management briefs that Mike touched on yesterday. So to set the context, as every speaker before me has today or at the conference, wildfire size and frequency is increasing throughout the Great Basin. Additionally, domestic livestock grazing is a major economic land use and disturbance throughout the basin. The BLM typically employs the 2-year rule, where they delay grazing for a minimum 2 years after fire. However, they face pretty significant pressure in reintroducing grazing quickly after wildfire. So the combination of these two things means that sustainable post-fire grazing management practices are essential to successful ecosystem recovery after wildfire. The purpose of the grazing brief was to synthesize the very limited literature on post-fire grazing management and the effects on sagebrush steppe communities into general but usable guidelines for post-fire grazing management in the sagebrush steppe. And our objective was to aid managers in making decisions that promote productive and resilient sagebrush steppe communities. We want to be clear that our target with the brief was specifically intact communities with native or introduced perennial bunch grasses as the dominant functional group, and not communities that have been completely converted to annual grasslands. These approaches don't really work. We have to take more significant restoration approaches in that case. To review post-fire recovery on the sagebrush steppe, bunch grasses can take between 1 and 3 years to recover to pre-fire conditions, and this has been shown pretty broadly. However, in warm or dry sites, lower elevation sites, or during an extended drought like we're having now, it may take longer than 3 years for those communities to recover, for them to vigorously produce viable seed and biomass so that they're replacing themselves in the community. Some of the factors that may affect post-fire restoration would be pre- and post-fire site conditions, such as post-fire weather, the relative community composition prior to the fire, and any post-fire restoration actions that any agencies have taken, such as aerial or drill seeding or herbicide application. And some implications of not resting or deferring grazing long enough may be that recovery on those sites may be slowed, or it may promote invasion of annual grasses. And you can see these two photos are on the same site in Eastern Oregon. The top site has yet to meet perennial cover criteria, so it should be delayed from grazing, while the bottom site has met the perennial cover criteria and grazing should be reintroduced. To address the recommendations that we synthesized in the brief, the season of use, growing season grazing, which we sort of approximated as April through July, although that can be earlier on lower sites, later on higher elevation sites, can decrease bunch grass recovery and survival. And this has been shown relatively broadly. So it's recommended that grazing be delayed until after seed maturity or shatter, which can increase recruitment and decrease mortality for those perennial bunch grasses. The photo at the bottom of the slide is a site from one of my own, or a plot from one of my own sites. Due to administrative mix-up, it was actually grazed this first growing season after fire. And you can see that inside the exclosure, grasses are still growing in late August. In fact, we went back 3 weeks ago and they're still growing into October, while all of the plants that were grazed relatively heavily outside the exclosure have senesced, and they senesced approximately mid-July. So it can have an effect, especially the first growing season after fire. In terms of grazing intensity, the NRCS recommends on unburned sites less than 50% utilization during the growing season and less than 60% utilization during the dormant season. So forage utilization would be the percentage of the above ground biomass that's consumed by livestock. It's an easy way to monitor how much of the vegetation is being consumed. However, lower utilization may be required to allow for perennial grasses and soils to recover. So it's best to be conservative after fire because those individuals have experienced a pretty severe disturbance event with the fire, and it's best to be able to allow them to recover and become viable again. Interestingly, Bates and Davies have shown that on some cool and moist sites, in this case the study was on a wetter Wyoming big sagebrush site, that a combination of deferred rotation, which I'll mention on the next slide, and low to moderate stocking rates, again less than 50% utilization, can function as sort of a combination of short and long-term rest. So rather than pure deferment of grazing, there are interesting ways you can sort of combine rotation systems and diversifying stocking rates to sort of achieve the same results. In terms of frequency and duration, it's suggested that a rotation system is implemented to maintain plant production, cover, and species composition. And three that we've identified in the brief are a rest rotation, deferred rotation, and a decisional system. And you can see with the figures on the left, a rest rotation system is that there's a standard rotation system, either within pastures in an allotment or allotments within an area, so that at any one point in time, several of the allotments or pastures are being rested to allow for recovery of those individuals. For a deferred system, there's more flexibility built into the system in that at the beginning of the growing season, when a forage allocation or when forage is measured to see what is available for grazing for that year, managers can determine whether or not 1, 2, 3, or all 4 potentially of these pastures need a rest. So they have the flexibility to sort of move livestock around within these pastures, within an allotment, to allow for rest on one area that needs a longer term rest. And then a decisional system is what the BLM does at the beginning of the growing season in terms of issuing an annual grazing authorization. They decide yes or no whether or not grazing is going to be allowed or authorized that year. In many cases during a drought or after a fire, BLM will say that due to lack of resource availability, we don't think that it's suitable to graze this year, so an annual authorization will not be issued. So this is what's implemented prior to the reintroduction of grazing, and then it should be continued again as well. So assessing on a yearly basis whether or not forage is available or the site is suitable for grazing. In addition, grazing may need to be less frequent or shorter in duration than prior to the fire due to the fact that repeated defoliation decreases recovery and survival on those bunch grasses. And this also comes from the NRCS recommendations on unburned sites. But Gwynn and Rouse recommend that perennial bunch grasses be grazed less than half of the growing season to begin with, only 1 out of every 3 years for native bunch grasses, and 2 out of every 3 years for introduced bunch grasses. And we would recommend that a more conservative approach than even that is taken. So again, this is for unburned sites. For post-fire grazing, it's best to be a little bit more conservative. I would argue, and I think our whole team would argue, that monitoring is the most important step, and it's been mentioned many times in the conference. So monitoring utilization levels of perennial grasses and other important functional groups to make sure that overgrazing is not occurring. If it is occurring, that grazing management practices are changed. Monitoring the relative community composition by functional group, especially perennial grasses and forbs, the presence of invasive annual grasses and forbs, and whether or not shrubs are recovering or establishing due to a seeding. In the Interpreting Indicators of Rangeland Health BLM handbook succinctly summarizes most of these into 3 groups: soil and site stability, hydrologic function, and biotic integrity. And there are 17 indicators of rangeland health, many of which we've identified in the brief. Some of the most important are percent bare ground, soil stability, which would be wind and water erosion, and the relative community composition on the site. Monitoring also allows for adaptive management. and this is essential, figuring out if what you're doing is working. If it isn't, changing that. However, Bates and Davies have shown that the effects of post-fire grazing may not be detectable in the first few years. So it's very important to continue monitoring and implementing adaptive management procedures out over time. They've shown that it may take more than 10 years to detect an effect on the vegetative community of post-fire grazing. And lastly, an indication that grazing management practices should be modified would be that there may be downward trends in perennial grass cover and forb cover, and if there's a failure to maintain other recovery objectives such as invasive plant cover. So in summary, grazing shouldn't be resumed until predefined management objectives have been met. It's very clear to identify these prior to implementing grazing. Secondly, grazing should be delayed until later in the season to allow for bunch grasses to recover. A rotation system should be implemented for maintaining plant production, cover, and species composition. And regular monitoring and assessment is required to determine when to initially reintroduce grazing, the effectiveness of post-fire grazing management practices, and if any changes in adaptive management are required. So as I've identified, there's a very small number of published studies on post-fire grazing in the sagebrush steppe. So it's very important that we as the research community add to this body of research, especially in a local context. And again, I really appreciate the question about whether or not, or what researchers can do to facilitate management on public lands. We have differences on every site. Wyoming big sagebrush is different from mountain big sagebrush. And so the interpretation of these very generalized guidelines at a local context is very important. Additionally, researchers can aid managers in designing their monitoring protocols to not only make them robust, but to actually answer those questions. So I know in my lab we're doing that with post-fire monitoring currently, but in the case of grazing management after fire, the same thing can be done to see whether or not these different management approaches are actually working, or if they're not working, how can we change them to work? So again, I want to present a point on the fact sheets. There's a broad range of fact sheet series. Mark's holding up one right now. Jeannie, who asked a question earlier, is the coordinator for the Fire Science Exchange. If you're interested in any of these, there's a broad range of topics. You can either get them on the FSC website, URL's right there, or you can talk to Jeannie in the lobby at lunch. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Questions?
Yeah.
How important is pre-fire monitoring to determine post-fire management?
So yeah, the question was how important is pre-fire monitoring? So basically understanding what was on the ground to post-fire management. It's important. It's great to have those data. If you don't have those data, there's not much you can do about it after the fire. However, there are regional programs that are being instituted, like the Assessment, Inventory, and Monitoring Protocol, where they are sampling very broadly within the Great Basin to get some of that baseline data so that if an allotment does burn, they have some data in advance. All of the offices, or all of the BLM field offices and districts in Nevada are using it. I know Northeastern California, Southern Idaho. So it's being instituted broadly. I think it's very important. In many cases, we don't have those data. That's the problem.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.